What's behind the latest escalation?
Thank you for having me. Well, the latest escalation really started on Friday. It's interesting that often the news stories pick up the Israeli actions as a response to rocket fire. But really, the current escalation began on Friday when an unarmed protester, a little child, was shot in the head by Israeli snipers while they participated in the Great March of Return protests. That resulted in a retaliation that Hamas and other factions carried out against IDF soldiers just beyond the fence area in the Gaza Strip. And that essentially started a tit-for-tat escalation that has resulted in the current crisis unfolding. I think it's important to understand and to reiterate every time we talk about every time we talk about the events and the escalations that happen sporadically in the Gaza Strip, that this is part of a story that is consistently happening. The escalations happen every few months because of a broader dynamic that is important to talk about.
So we're certainly not presenting one side of the story, as you may have alluded earlier. The Israelis are calling these targeted strikes. You mentioned a child being shot in the head, more civilians in the firing line. A 1-year-old baby and her pregnant aunt are actually among the dead. So it's not just the Gaza militants that are targeted here.
Absolutely. It's really important to understand that this isn't a situation where Israel is carrying out surgical attacks on the Gaza Strip. There is, as there always are with the military assaults that Israel launches on the Gaza Strip, civilian casualties. But the more important point to stress here is that the reason that these escalations keep on happening is because there is structurally a blockade that is in place that inflicts a form of collective punishment on 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. The blockade is itself a violent structure that inflicts severe harm on civilians, on economy, on the infrastructure in the Gaza Strip. And it's really this fundamental act of occupation that has taken the form of a blockade over the past 10 years is what is the driver of these recurring cycles of escalation. It's very easy for us to focus on events as they unfold and to try to understand why a certain escalation happens at a specific moment in time. But really the question we need to be asking is, why do these escalations keep occurring and how can they stop conclusively? And the only answer for that is to deal with the fact that the Gaza Strip remains under occupation through a stifling blockade that really limits any form of life, any form of quality of life in the Gaza Strip, and the situation is not sustainable.
Lastly and briefly, Tareq Baconi, after the last bout of violence in March, we saw international mediation attempts. Is a ceasefire agreement out of reach at this time, given that even if one is reached, it's unlikely that Israel will deliver its end of the bargain?
So the reality is that there was a ceasefire agreement that was agreed indirectly between Israel and Hamas in November of last year. And that's really the backdrop to this escalation. Israel agreed to start loosening access into the Gaza Strip and start dealing with the economic situation in Gaza to alleviate some of the humanitarian suffering. In return, Hamas had accepted in November that it would start limiting its own attacks against Israel. Unfortunately, we've seen since then several escalations happen, and the underlying driver is because while Hamas has, for a large part, met its side of the bargain in terms of limiting escalations, Israel hasn't actually loosened access into the Gaza Strip in any sustainable or effective way. So right now, the parties are once again in indirect negotiation under Egyptian and UN mediation. There might be some form of agreement reached, even if that averts a current escalation, which seems unlikely given the death toll. That itself will not be sustainable unless Israel meets its side of the ceasefire agreement.
Tareq Baconi.